So as Taylor mentioned, I've been working with Namibia now for probably 5 or 6 years with our, we've got an office there. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing there. It's all, I do a variety of different projects. It's all based around conservation science, but specifically here I'll sort of discuss some studies that try and look at the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem services, which is of course one of the big questions in conservation. You may know this already from sort of Taylor being here, but so I work for the US branch of World Wildlife Fund, even though I'm actually based in Vancouver now. And though we're WWF-US, we actually, most of our field work is actually done overseas, as you can see from the map here. So in orange we have our 16 or so terrestrial priority places, and then in blue some marine priority places as well. So I'm in the science division at WWF, and a main part of our job is providing technical support and scientific advice to these various field programs, which are often sort of lacking in that kind of capacity for a variety of reasons. And so among our staff, lots of us have particular places where we work and due to sort of historical reasons that we can get into maybe later, I'm going to talk about specifically my work here in one of these places, Namibia. Good. So I'm going to give just a brief introduction to Namibia and then this CBNRM program that WWF supports, and that's community-based natural resource management. And then talk more specifically about the relationship between biodiversity and income generation for communities, and some of the data that we've used to test those relationships to see if they exist. Okay, so Namibia, so CBNRM, community-based natural resource management. But first, so Namibia, just to give you some context, so it's here in southern Africa. South Africa is to the south of it, and then Botswana is to the east. You've got Angola, Zambia, and Zimbabwe also bordering it. The country is quite diverse in that it goes, there's obviously it's on the coast of the ocean, and you've got this desert that runs along the coast, so they're in green. That's very low elevation. You've got this crazy escarpment that you then go up in a really short distance, so the elevation is incredibly steep. Then you get into this sort of mountainous terrain and then a high plateau. The area of Namibia, sorry, these are all in metric, sorry for that. So you can see it's about 40 times bigger than Vermont, but about 4 times the population size. So it's very sparsely populated, and in fact the second lowest population density in the world, and that's because it's very dry there, largely. And you've got this big desert along the coast, and it's dry everywhere, as we'll see in a moment. So the rainfall between 0, essentially, on the coast at the desert to 600 millimeters in the far east. And again, in comparison to Burlington, about 1,000 millimeters. And you've got this sort of gradient in vegetation. So from the sort of west of the country, you've got essentially almost no vegetation, these gravel plains. And then as you go to the east and to the north, you get into some savanna, some woodland, shrubland. And then over here is actually where you find the woodland, but you never get forests like you do here in Vermont. So biomass at the most, you get about 50 tons per hectare. And again, in forests in Vermont, you've got over twice that much. So we're talking about systems even in the far northeast where the most trees are, less than 40% of the land cover would be trees. In terms of biodiversity, so why is sort of WWF interested in Namibia? There's a lot of interesting, this is just a figure of plant diversity, which is highest in the central part of the country, and that's a theme that we'll come back to in a moment. There's actually a lot of very interesting endemic species along the escarpment here, but the main reason that WWF is concerned or works in Namibia is sort of its large wildlife that tends to be on the fringes of its ranges. So we've got the world's largest population of unfenced black rhino that's desert adapted. It always amazes me when I'm traveling through the northwest of the country. It's incredibly harsh, incredibly arid, but you wouldn't expect to see anything living there, but you've actually got this quite rich levels of wildlife diversity. And so specifically elephants, giraffes, lions, cheetahs, and so forth in these incredibly arid areas. and then some endemic species like Hartman's mountain zebra, black-faced impala. So you've got this really interesting combination of very high aridity, high levels of plant endemics, and then this really interesting community of large mammals that have managed to eke out a living in this very difficult landscape. Then in terms of people and history, so this is among the sort of oldest occupied human areas. So it's now thought that the cradle of humanity, which originally people had believed to be in East Africa, is now thought to be in this kind of area of southern Africa. So the San or the Bushmen, sort of that group of people. Unfortunately, it's got a very extensive history of outside occupation in a really negative way. So it was a German colony, and they sort of perpetrated all sorts of atrocities to the native peoples. It became a part of South Africa after World War I, and so suffered under the apartheid-type system along with the rest of the country. And it only gained its independence in 1990, so it's a very, very young country. Unfortunately, sort of that history of outside occupation is still reflected in a very unequal distribution of land and power. So, as I mentioned before, the sort of central areas of the country are the most productive in terms of natural resources. And this sort of pink color here indicates private farmlands. And most of that is still white-owned, so very large farms owned by sort of the Afrikaner descendants. And then the more marginal areas, like in the desert here and some of the sort of less productive areas in Bushman land here, these are communal areas. So these are sort of where, unfortunately, a lot of the sort of native inhabitants have sort of been pushed out from those farmlands and live in those communal areas. And it's these green areas where this community-based natural resource management program is taking place.
The farmland is cropland or pasture?
Mostly pasture, so mostly livestock, because again, it's so arid, it's difficult to grow. There is some cropping up in the northeast in sort of smallholder systems, but this here is basically ranching country here and very productive. Okay, so now turning to the community-based natural resource management program. So this really began in the mid-1990s. So prior to that time, all of the natural resources on communal lands actually belonged to the government. So local people weren't allowed to benefit or use natural resources in any way. So the wildlife that were on their lands, they weren't allowed to hunt, they weren't allowed to use in sort of tourism activities and so forth. That all belonged to the government. So there's really no economic incentive for them to conserve or to tolerate wildlife, and so it was only seen as a cost. And as a result of that, and also as a result of a big drought that happened in the 1990s, wildlife was really, really low. So many species were sort of on the edge of extirpation in a lot of the country. But that changed. So in 1996, as part of this newly independent country, laws were changed to allow a devolution of user rights to natural resources to local communities. And so what that means is that under this legislation, communities were allowed now to benefit from natural resources such as wildlife and plant products. They did have to do a few things. What they did have to do is register their customary land holdings as these things called communal conservancies. And so these are areas that have geographical boundaries that need to be zoned and sustainably managed, and that they need to consult with the Ministry of Environment and Tourism on that. And they're sort of different from the nature conservancy type vision of a conservancy, which is mostly just about conservation. These are really areas where people and wildlife are living together. And so it's about trying to find sustainable solutions for both, to allow conservation of biodiversity, but also to ensure that, people in these very marginalized areas are able to, hopefully improve their livelihoods as a result of that management. Okay, so here's a map of communal conservancies. So again, we've got Namibia and Southern Africa. In green, we're looking at conservancies. The dark green are those that already exist, and the light green are those that are called emerging, so communities have expressed an interest in formally registering their customary land holdings as conservancies. So there's now 77 of them. The first one was established in 1998. So it's about 150,000 kilometers, square kilometers, so about 20% of the country's landmass is is under communal conservation. In brown, you've got formal protected areas. So you can see that the green and the brown are sort of almost about the same amount of area. So we're really getting up to quite a high fraction of the country that's under some form of conservation management. And the CBNRM program involves about 250,000 people, so 11% of the population. Okay, so how do people benefit from this program? So there's a number of different ways. So a big one is tourism, and these sort of images give you an idea of the kind of niche. You've got, like I was mentioning earlier on, you've got this combination of wildlife and arid landscapes, and some of these landscapes are really spectacular. So, seeing things like oryx among these dunes, or desert elephants in riverbeds with mountains along either side is really quite spectacular. So that's Namibia's niche, really, in terms of tourism. There's a couple of flavors of tourism. So you've got these really nice community campsites in a lot of areas, and they're beautifully done that are catering to people who are self-driving around, and that's another nice aspect of Namibia. You can actually drive yourself around. The roads are quite good, and it's quite safe. But then the big profits for communities actually come from high-end tourism, where companies are building quite high-end lodges and so forth to cater to more upscale international tourists. Another big one and a controversial one is trophy hunting. So this generates a lot of income from the sale of hunting tags and again, just bringing in mostly foreigners to hunt animals. It's always interesting talking about this as someone who works for WWF because it's the kind of thing that a lot of people feel very strongly against. But I think it's and sometimes actually people at WWF don't like it when I mention that this is a big part of the conservation plank. But I think to me it's important to to be transparent about it, and there's a big hunting culture in Southern Africa, and it's always it's always been that way. It does generate quite a bit of money for communities, but it obviously it has to be done correctly, and so there's all sorts of issues around that that we can get into later. But I do want to mention that is a source of income for the program. Those first two are really the big ones, but I think there's an increasing recognition that there needs to be some diversification because both of those two income-generating activities rely on international tourism. So if there is ever some shock to the system where international visitors were cut down, that would be a big problem in terms of generation. So there is a sort of increasing emphasis on trying to explore how plant products can be used for income generation. And there's actually some really interesting examples of plants that have sort of anti-inflammatory or anti-pain properties like devil's claw. There's contracts that have been signed between local communities in the Northwest, and I always forget if it's L'Oreal or one of those other cosmetic companies that I don't know anything about, but they've signed contracts to provide aromatic oils from some different species of comifera, and then there's the classic handicrafts and so forth. So this is a small part of the income generation, but one that I think is going to be increasing in the future and has big potential. And then wild meat is used. So this is sort of separate from the trophy hunting element, although communities do get the meat when trophy hunters shoot animals. But this is actually seen, although this isn't something where the meat is necessarily sold, but communities actually view this as a real strong positive element of the program, because now in these these marginalized poor areas where protein deficiency can be a big issue, they're now allowed to hunt these animals and eat them, and that's even though it's not bringing in a lot of income to communities, it's seen as something that A, for health reasons is important, but B, just an assertion of their rights that had been removed from them for so long. So that's another important benefit that's been realized through the program. So what kind of outcomes have we seen? So again, this program legislation was instituted in 1996. The first Conservancy was gazetted in 1998. And so since that time, the area under conservation management has about doubled. So over 30% of the country is in some form of conservation management. And you know, it's all, that total is really incredibly high when you look at the range of countries and what different countries have protected in terms of their land base. And we can see, I think that's right for Vermont, about 15% of the state is under some form of protection. And you know, to me, for a developing country that's gone through the history that it has, it's quite impressive that you've got this level of conservation. We've also seen some pretty major increases in wildlife. So these are 3 species of desert-adapted animals. So we've got oryx on the top, and then springbok, and then Hartmann's mountain zebra. And you can see, you know, the quite obvious increasing trends from the 1980s. It's not clear that all of this is due. In fact, I'm pretty sure we can't say that 100% of this increase is due to the CBNRM program, because like I was mentioning, there was a big drought in the 80s that, in combination with poaching, had really hammered populations. But you know, I think it's fair to say that it has played a role in this wildlife recovery. We're starting to see some tapering off, especially in the top 2 species in the Northwest now of population levels, and I think that also illustrates one of the issues that the program is facing, and that's managing expectations. So a lot of these community members have sort of been participating in the CBNRM program from an era where things really increased, but you know, it can't keep increasing forever. And especially, you know, the earlier conservancies were put in some of the more favorable areas, and so communities that are now coming on board, I think one of the key things to make them aware of is that they might not necessarily see the same spectacular increases or income generations that some of the earlier communities did see. Nevertheless, this is, you know, a strong level of increase. There's a similar level of increase, maybe not quite as dramatic in the northeast part of the country for predators, and in the Northwest as well. And that's one of the, you know, it's one thing to have populations of animals that aren't really conflict species that can be used for meat and so forth to increase, but you know, when you see things like predators increasing, that's a sign that I think the sort of ethic of conservation is starting to take hold, or at least that they're seeing benefits from having even these dangerous, damaging species around.
Are those data, by the way, from government surveys, or are they?
So the communities themselves actually do surveys every year, and so that's where the later data is from. Yeah, it's as far as I understand, it's the world's biggest ground-based survey of wildlife.
And the government collects or collates.
That's right. Yeah, and I won't talk about it here, but there's a whole system and a lot of work that's been done by WWF staff there on, you know, how do you get people who are, you know, pastoralists, you know, not formally educated and so forth, to collect data that's, you know, robust enough to use for these kind of things, but also useful and interesting to them, because if not, it won't happen. So that's been, you know, the sort of element of monitoring of the program is one that's a lot of effort has been put into, and to develop it in a way that's meaningful for both parties. So not only increases in numbers, but sort of expansion of ranges. So this is data for lions that in the mid-1990s were restricted to that Etosha National Park, which is that blob there, but you can see have sort of expanded over time through the Northwest, and this is just a fantastic photo that I like to show, that this sort of giraffe getting hammered in the Northwest by these desert lions. So along with the wildlife increases in aggregate, you've also seen these income increases, which is, you know, in part, as you would expect, because more conservancies have been coming online over time, so incomes go up for that. But you're also, in addition to that, you do simply see that conservancies, individual conservancies, are earning more now over time. But again, some evidence of plateauing out. So again, this idea that things can't just continue to grow forever, and there needs to be some management of expectations along those lines. And just to sort of emphasize what I said before, so these are different types of income-generating activities, and the main point is that you can see that ecotourism and trophy hunting account for the lion's share of that, and typically it's 80 to 90% fall income in a given year. But there's a lot of variation around that. So this is at a program level, so all the conservancies in the country. But there's a lot of variation in individual conservancies, and that's what I want to turn to now.
Suppose they found oil under one of these conservancies. Is that an okay thing to
Yeah.
exploit, or is it not?
That's a great question. I'm not totally sure. I suspect the subsurface rights are still with the government. They have discovered oil recently off the coast, like in other parts of the world. Again, it's not an issue because conservancies aren't sort of these maritime bodies. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, but my guess is that that still remains with the government. That's a good question, though.
The average age of the hunters have changed lately in the last like 10 years?
Of the community hunters or of the foreign hunters?
Foreigners and community.
That's a good question also. That I don't know. Most of the hunters are from South Africa or from Europe, some from America. Germany especially, because of the German legacy here, there's a strong connection with Germany, so a lot of German hunters go over. I don't know in terms of age. I'm not even sure how we would assess that data. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in terms of local communities, what I do know is that there is, a sense that the younger generation is a bit more disconnected from wildlife in general, whether it's through hunting or through, whatever sort of means of appreciation, like in many other places as well.
Yes.
So there's in fact an initiative now to try and formally capture some of this traditional ecological knowledge, especially of the San, of the Bushmen, who have these phenomenal tracking skills in the older generations, but that are being eroded and not being passed on to the younger generation. So there's actually a German-funded school now that's trying to sort of, have the funding and mechanisms in place to formally pass on that tracking information from the San elders to the younger generation. And so it's, like everywhere, you see sort of this increasing disconnect between nature and people, and I think it's similar here. On the flip side, you do see in the younger generation like really interesting and enhanced sort of business acumen in terms of managing conservancies. Just recently, I heard a story about a couple of WWF staff who went up to one of these conservancies in the Northeast, and they had a new conservancy manager, and they were just blown away by how savvy he was in terms of management. I think he'd gone to South Africa for school, but still coming from an incredibly poor, $2 a day type of community to being, managing this conservancy like really, really well and really effectively. So, trade-offs, I guess. Okay, so turning to the science side of things. So, biodiversity and income generation. So, like I mentioned, there's variation among individual conservancies in terms of how they're generating income. And these pie charts basically just give a visual representation of how some conservancies focus mostly on one type of activity. So for example, Kasika is tourism. Others have more of a balanced mix and so forth. So there's different types of strategies. So we're interested in trying to explore what things affect that variation. And the sort of some of the obvious things are just the natural ecological endowment that conservancies have, social capital issues in terms of management, whether it's good, whether it's bad, and so forth. But specifically, what at least I was interested in testing was this idea of whether diversity is a significant input into that variation. And more specifically, in areas after controlling for these other factors, do you have more income in areas that have higher biodiversity? Because we hear about this all the time. This idea that the more biodiversity you have, the better ecosystems function, the more services they produce, and so forth. But most of that really comes from these small-scale experiments, very controlled situations, and so forth. And this is a plot of this one big experiment in Europe that was looking at, I think it was biomass and how that changes with species richness. And there's lots of different plots that I could show you from lots of different studies, but there's really very little evidence from the real world for this. So we realized that we could, we had the data to try and to do these kind of tests. And so we did two separate studies. So one that was using quite quantitative measures of wildlife community structure, or assemblages from the Northwest. And these data, or this figure here, shows the transects from which some of that early data that we saw in population trends come from. So these are surveyed every year by driving along these transects. In other cases, we used all the conservancies throughout the country and just looked at simpler measures of species richness and so forth. And obviously we couldn't do a controlled experiment like a lot of this other sort of evidence for the relationship between diversity and services comes from, but we could use statistical methods to try and control for these other factors and isolate that effect of biodiversity and income generation from both hunting and tourism. And what we found is that no matter how we characterize diversity, so whether it's using these techniques from community ecology to look at the structure of community assemblages, or whether it's using these simpler measures of just species richness, when we build regression models that control for the geography, that control for social factors and so forth, we do find that there's a strong positive effect of diversity on the various types of income generation. So in this case, we're looking at hunting income after controlling for other factors. And this is sort of analogous to those plots that I showed on that earlier graph, where you've got species richness on the X, some measure of ecosystem services or income from ecosystem service in this case, and quite a strong positive relationship. And so I did put in this slide here because I know the history of this department is about sort of economic valuation, and so you can actually use those models, and you've got coefficients on these different types of elements of biodiversity. And since your dependent variable is income, you can actually use that model to sort of assess how changes in those variables result in dollar changes. So for example, for wildlife species, an additional species of wildlife on a conservancy results in a gain of $3,000 or so for hunting and $2,000 or so for tourism. For one of the big 5 species, it's a lot more, as you might expect, so $10,000 or $20,000.
That's per species if it's a member of the Big 5.
That's right. So each additional Big 5 species that you add in a conservancy or that a conservancy has results in that. Yes, per year. And then for black rhino, it's a lot more. And this is really the iconic species of conservation and concern, and there's specific rhino tracking activities and so forth that happen on a conservancy. So again, as you might expect, so big gains. So yeah, it's quite interesting. We didn't actually focus on these results in our work, but it's stuff that you can pull out. And so I mean, it's a nice illustration of the kind of valuation that you can do using these methods.
A question, in terms of the social factors that you can control for,
Yep.
Can you talk about those a little bit?
Sure, yeah, so there's sort of measures of governance. So each of these committees has each of these conservancies has a management committee. And so that's composed of a known percentage of men and women, and so you can assess whether the size of the committee is having an effect, the percentage of women on the committee. You can also basically age since the Conservancy was formed tends to be quite a strong predictor because, well, for 2 reasons. Those that were formed earliest tended to be in the most likely spot, both socially and geographically, but also because they've had more time to learn how to manage. So it was those types of things. And there's other variables as well that we could look at. We're a little limited by sample size because there are only about 50 or 60 conservancies at the time we did this, so we can't include everything under the sun, but yeah. The other thing that I've just recently been working on, so this section I would characterize as more speculative or in progress, is looking at trade-offs among production of trophy hunting and ecotourism. So remember, those are the 2 big income-generating activities, 80 to 90%, typically on a year-to-year basis. But potentially, at least, not particularly complementary on a finite land base. So for example, there was a recent incident where a buffalo was shot in front of a group of tourists who were on a river. They weren't so happy about that. So you can imagine that, that there's a lot of issues trying to run both of these things on a finite land base, so particularly when it's small. Obviously, there was a particular zoning problem in that instance, but it does raise the more general question of what's sort of the best strategy for these conservancies, in terms of if they have options to allocate their effort to either trophy hunting or to ecotourism or to some mix of both of them. There's a temporal element to this story, and that's that in the early years, so we're looking at income on the y-axis and years since conservancy formation on the x-axis. and then in green, tourism, and in brown, trophy hunting. And what you can see is that in the early years, there tends to be more, so this is, again, across all conservancies. In the early years, there tends to be more trophy hunting income, and then it switches at about year 5. And then you see a lot more, both of them still increase, but you see a lot more ecotourism income. And the reason that's happening is that it takes a lot less capital input to sort of derive income from trophy hunting. So these guys tend to be, you just need to grab a guide and go out into the bush and you set up camp somewhere and you do your hunting. Whereas for the well-heeled ecotourist requires a little more than that. And so you've got to build a lodge and get in place the infrastructure and the training and so forth. And once you do that, which takes apparently around 5 years, then you start to reap the benefits. But the point is, in those early years, that sort of small but nevertheless important level of income from trophy hunting is important. So one way to think about, so for the economists in the room, one way to think about this decision on whether to produce one good versus another in a sort of mock two-good system is looking at production possibility frontiers. So you've got, in this case, you've got the classic guns versus butter example. We've got amount produced of guns on the y-axis and butter on the x-axis. But basically you can have any two goods, and I think it's, again, because trophy hunting and tourism are the dominant income generating activities, it's maybe appropriate to look at it from this kind of framework. So you've got, in this case, you've got this sort of concave shape of production function where really you're maximizing things if you're more out towards the middle. You can, and that's the way this is often represented, this type of PPF. But it's also possible that these things could be linear, where it doesn't really matter where you are on the curve, or it could be shaped in this convex way, where it's actually better to shift out towards the ends. And so again, this is potentially a framework in which to look at this, this system where you're either deciding on whether to produce ecotourism and trophy hunting. So what I wanted to do is simply plot out the data for all the years and all the conservancies and see what kind of pattern emerges. And so that's what I'm going to show here. So it's interesting, and again, as I mentioned earlier, different conservancies have different strategies. So some conservancies, like this one here, and the lines are connected serially over time, simply produce more hunting income over time, but don't switch into tourism at any point. Some of them do the reverse, so they just go up the y-axis and produce more tourism income over time. But most of them actually are in the middle somewhere, but showing these sort of different evolution of ratios over time. When you plot all the data, that's what it looks like. And so then you've got these three potential shapes, and I think it's quite obvious, it's certainly not that sort of outwardly bulging production, some PPF frontier rather, and when you actually try and fit that statistically, this is what happens. So it's clearly a very bad fit, which you can just see by eyeballing it. The linear fit is a lot better, but again, this is, I was testing these statistically. I'm not showing you the results here, but the best fit is this actually convex one. And again, you can see it just by eyeballing the data. And so what that means is that it actually is true, at least based on what we've observed to date, that it would be ideal for conservancies to go to one side or the other, depending on sort of where they initially start doing, rather than having some mix. But yet you do see a fair number of them do have some mix. So this is, either it's a measure of inefficiency in their strategies, or there's some other things that are going on that we haven't been able to capture. But nevertheless, sort of as a framework for trying to understand this, I think it's potentially got some use. And what's interesting is that maybe like a lot of other economic concepts, which are well established in economic theory, I've actually found very little data to try and, to test this idea, especially in terms of conservation. I wasn't able to find any. So we're hoping to try and push this forward a little bit. One other thing that I'd like to do is try and explore variation. So much as we explored variation in overall aggregate levels of trophy hunting income and in tourism income, looking at the ratios or the distance to the frontier between these two things and asking the same types of questions. So, do we see the same effect of wildlife diversity on the level of inefficiency? Are the more efficient conservancies those that have higher diversity? Or is there some other factors that are affecting whether the ratio of trophy hunting income to tourism income. So that's sort of a future step. And yeah, no, I would definitely welcome any thoughts on this. This is not, I haven't done this type of work before, so any ideas that you all might have in terms of how to interpret these diagrams, how to go forward in terms of explaining the patterns that what I see would be really useful. So, yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
What are the chances that those trajectories could keep moving out?
Good, I think. Yeah, I think
So
we'd
it could
expect.
change the...
Yeah, certainly it would change the other things. Yeah. Yeah, I think you would expect to see things keep going out over time. Whether that changes the shape or not, I'm not sure. One thing I have that I also want to explore is, I mean, we do have the data to test that. So if would be smaller data sets, but I could restrict it to just year 1 after conservancy formation. What does that look like? Year 2, year 3, year 4. So, yeah. But I think we would expect certainly the overall level of things to move out. Whether the shape changes, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the practical management implications of this relationship. So going to conservancies, and then also, some of the thoughts on why they might not want to move towards one end of the PPF.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of practical management implications, I mean, look, a lot of the WWF work is involves supporting these conservancies in their income generating activities. So, depending on what comes out of this, it may be that we're advising them to do the wrong things. So, it could be that instead of advising them to focus on such and such activity, it should actually be the reverse, or it should be a mix or something. But I think that's going to be conditioned by this analysis where we look at what's affecting the relative position of these different conservancies. And the preliminary stuff I've done suggests that in this case, there's not so strong a relationship between diversity, and it's more sort of immutable topographic or geographical effects that are important in condition. I'm not showing you these results, but because it's very, very preliminary, but these inefficiencies of conservancies might more be related to their natural endowment that they're kind of stuck with. And so it's hard to manage away from that kind of thing.
So like
that's one
hunters
possible.
will go farther than
Yeah.
ecotourists.
So exactly. So if you're in a really rough topographical area where it's difficult to get people about, you might have to do trophy hunting because they're more willing to beat around the bush than tourists who need sort of more, better infrastructure and closer to main tourist routes and so forth.
So I'm trying to connect this part to the previous part.
Yeah, me too.
Here you go, I'm just going to give it to you then.
Great.
So is the ratio between tourism and income a function of the diversity of wildlife on the Conservancy?
So that's the test that I want to do.
Okay.
And I'm still kind of preliminary. My initial things that I've done suggest no.
So
Unlike
tourists and hunters are equally attracted to diversity. You know what I mean? So,
No.
okay. I would think like if you achieve some sort of wildlife diversity,
Yeah.
maybe your attractiveness shifts to the tourists from the hunters,
I
or
see.
the reverse.
I
That's
see.
what I mean by is it a function of like,
Okay.
as these places evolve and get more diverse, is that explaining some shifting from hunting
Yeah.
to tourism or the other way?
Right. And so my answer is that no, that hasn't, at least what I've done so far, it hasn't explained
Okay.
that, even though you might expect that in
Yeah.
theory. And that's what we saw in the earlier work where we just looked at raw income levels
Yeah.
rather than the ratio between the two.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other way that they might be related is, it just seems like tourism is much more profitable. Like,
Yes.
look at those two axes.
Yeah, exactly.
So, almost all the conservancies are making more money on tourists than hunting. All those colors are taller on the Y than they are to the right.
Yeah, I
on
should
the
have put,
X.
I do have a graph somewhere where they're on the same
Scale
axis.
equivalently.
Yeah, so it's true that is true,
Yeah.
but there is still variation around that. So
Right.
yeah, there are some conservancies who, for whatever reason, have focused more on trophy hunting.
Yeah. Even
Even
despite what I just said.
Despite that in aggregate,
Yeah, you're right. There's
what-
3 specialists way out
yeah,
there.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's some of those specialists, and then even some in the sort of, there are some in the middle here. It's hard to see because it's kind of clustered, but yeah.
Okay.
I just have a question about, as they say, the narrative here.
Mm,
I mean, you started with an area and people
mm,
who otherwise might have done something different,
Mhm.
maybe depleted their wildlife,
Yeah.
maybe sold out to a mining company, I
Mhm.
don't know.
Mhm.
And now this is working, but if you look ahead, as they
Mhm.
get more affluent, I guess in a way it's silly to ask this question, but where does it go?
Yeah.
And do they really have more coherence or power or whatever to make a nice future versus
Mm. Mm.
end up looking like New Jersey anyway?
Yeah, that's.
Hey
yeah.
Sorry.
Before or after Sandy?
I think it's a great question, and I think, sometimes I think I'm guilty also of painting too rosy a picture. There are big issues still that need to be addressed. One is that for all that we know that incomes have increased at the level of communities, we're still not very clear on what's happening below that at the household level, and who's actually benefiting. Is it being captured by elites? Is it going more generally to communities and so forth? So that's a big issue that I think has huge implications for the future. The other thing is that this country, as I mentioned, is very low population density. So it's got an inherent advantage when you're trying to do sort of conservation-based development. And whether that changes in the future, the area is projected to get a lot wetter due to climate change. Population is growing. AIDS has been a major depressant of population growth, but that's starting to come under control. So, and then finally in the Northeast, you do have pretty high levels of population as compared to the Northwest. So it'll be interesting to see whether, and they're a lot smaller there too, so it'll be interesting to see whether those two areas start to diverge. Right now, they've both been pretty successful, but in terms of where it's going, I think it's hard to say at this stage. And but nevertheless, I think it's something that, for me personally, it would be better to keep more in mind and maybe to touch on a little bit, because I've been mostly focused on using the data that has been generated up until now to explain what has happened rather than predicting what's going on into the future. And I think some of this production possibility stuff has some potential to answer that question, but I think it's good for me to keep that in mind too.
All right, we should stop. It's a little bit after 1. Let's thank Robin again.
Thank you guys.